Alrighty, welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, unidentified humanoid objects. We are here to talk about the American Civil War. We talked last time about all the stuff that led up to it. Today we're going to get into it in earnest. Like everything in this series, it's a fairly broad overview. Basically, every slide in this episode could be its own episode. It is an incredibly deep and diverse topic, but for right now, we're going to keep it fairly topical. Let's get into it. So, let me get my cursor out of the way. Fort Sumter falls. That marks the beginning of the Civil War in an official capacity. So, there is a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, and the Confederate military captures it. With the fall of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, and that action, the call for volunteers, makes people very upset. Some states that were previously on the fence end up joining the South because they thought it was tyrannical that the government was calling for volunteers to fight in this war. As we'll see later, it's going to become more than just a call for volunteers. Some people are going to get voluntold, and that's what people really have an issue with. So it causes a lot of previously neutral people to join the South, and we see that with the secession of what's called the Upper South. So last episode, we ended with the secession of the South. What now today would be called the Deep South. So it's everything in that dark red color: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. The Upper South is what the parts of the South that had not previously seceded. So it's everything in that lighter red color. Excuse me, I said Arkansas for the Deep South. The Upper South that secedes is Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. We're going to talk about Virginia later, but West Virginia exists because of the Civil War. Part of Virginia did not want to be part of the South. They didn't want to really fight at all. So that's where West Virginia and Virginia split, and that's where they come from. I want to be very clear here, especially as someone who, did a lot of growing up in Texas, but also was a teacher in the Northeast. I have seen and heard a lot of different ways American history has been taught, and I want to make it abundantly clear. There are arguments both ways, and I understand them, and we are going to talk about them. However, the governments, maybe not the people, but the governments, the state governments of the South, of the Confederacy, absolutely fought this war over slavery. If you don't believe me, excuse me, sorry, there was a little ruckus outside. If you don't believe me, there is a link here on the slide. I know you can't click the slide, but it's here for me to remind you that it's in the description. What this link is going to do is going to bring you to the Avalon Project, which is out of Yale Law, Yale University, their law school. Excuse me, I don't know why it was so hard for me to get that out. The law school at Yale put this project together. It was called the Avalon Project, and it does a whole bunch of different things. This link will bring you to the Declaration of Secession by the state of Mississippi. And then you can navigate that site and read the other southern states' declarations of secession. They very clearly state that that is why they are seceding. The Avalon Project is really cool. There's a bunch of historical documents that are preserved there. Absolutely check it out. But that link will bring you right there if you want to read further. Like I said, someone who grew up in Texas, you get a not unbiased telling of history. And I ran with that and defended it for a very long time until I went to college for history and got in arguments with professors about it. And then my advisor sat me down and made me read out loud to him this exact document, Mississippi's Declaration of Secession. And that is really what allowed me to get my personal feelings out of the way and read the historical documents for what they were. And it tells you right there in black and white that the governments fought this war over slavery. And we'll talk about how and why that can be different with individual soldiers later. But rant over, moving on. What I was getting at is there is absolutely a historical phenomenon. What is the difference in why soldiers fight battles and why governments wage war. I have a bunch of pictures up here. There is Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It is absolutely the same phenomenon that can be applied to the Civil War as well. We just talked at length about why the Southern governments were waging this war. Why some farmer from Alabama or Texas was going to fight in this war, their reasons can and probably were entirely different than why the government was waging the war. The idea of a Southerner's honor. How do you gain that honor? You gain that on the battlefield. There is also the idea of popular sovereignty of the individual. Individual sovereignty is absolutely a thing and a phenomenon. Why should I have to listen to some guy way over there who doesn't know me or my situation or my life? Why should he be able to tell me what I am and allowed to do? For the individual, this is where the argument of state rights can be applied. Remember, we talked about, several episodes ago, only about 5% of Southerners owned slaves. That means 95% of the people who were a part of the Confederate military did not own slaves. Why would they be fighting for something that they don't have a stake in? Because they feel that what the government is doing is tyrannical. The individual feeling of having maybe not something that applies directly to you, but you can see if they can tell that really rich guy over there what to do, of course they can tell me what to do, and I don't want that. The same thing applies to a lot of more modern conflicts. In Vietnam, did a lot of those soldiers go there because they wanted to contain communism and they didn't want it to spread to Laos and Cambodia? No. Well, a lot of them went because they were drafted. But once they were there, why are they fighting? Why do soldiers fight any battle ever, regardless of what they believe in? To save the guy next to them. You're fighting for your buddies. You're fighting for the guy next to you in your foxhole, for the guy who you sat next to, and for the guy, for all of that camaraderie. You're making sure that your buddies get out of there. It may have absolutely nothing to do with the politics of why that war was declared or why those people got sent there. The individual's reasoning can and usually is entirely different than the government's reasoning. And that is what I want everybody to keep in mind as we move forward through this entire series. We are going to talk about a lot of conflicts where this is the case. I mean, let me know in the comments below, but the only conflict I can think of where the individual's reasoning for going aligned even remotely with the government's reason for going is World War II. If you guys can think of any others or any good arguments for any other, let me know in the comments below. But that's just my personal, admittedly, opinion. But I think you guys can see where I was going. Again, another rant over. I'll do my best to contain those moving forward. Border states. What is going on here? So the Upper South secedes. And remember, all Lincoln wants to do is preserve the Union. And what he really wants to do is hold on to the border states. What are the border states? They're everything in red here. So Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Delaware. It is very important to keep these states as part of the Union. They are a buffer zone. Basically, it's a strategic move more than one made out of emotion. Not really because he cared about the way that those states operated, but because he needed them for the war. And we're going to see that Lincoln has a very tactical, logistical mindset. He does not make decisions out of emotion, for the most part. Unfortunately, for the people living in those border states, regardless of how important they were, Lincoln imposes martial law in Maryland and eventually a couple of other states because the people there did not agree with the Union. They weren't so radical as they wanted to join the South, although there was a fair sentiment of that in several places, especially Missouri and Kentucky. But a lot of people didn't exactly agree with the Union either. And in Maryland specifically, a bunch of mobs were attacking the Union soldiers who were staging there for an invasion of the South. If you're not familiar with the term martial law, what that means, basically it means the military gets put in charge of everything. All of the civilian authorities who were previously there are replaced with people in the military, and civil rights are thrown out the window. You don't have civil rights under martial law. You can be arrested and held without trial. It changes absolutely everything. It is not a very traditionally American thing that happens. It opposes everything that we think we have rights to as Americans. It is very hard for some people to wrap their minds around that concept because, we have, free speech and we have the right to bear arms and, we have the right to oppose soldiers in our homes and all of those things, rightful search and seizures, all that stuff. If martial law is imposed, none of that matters. It all gets thrown out the window. And that's how easily a tyrannical government can flex its power, and that's exactly what Lincoln was doing in Maryland here. The North. How are they set up right now? They have a population of about 22 million people, and this is really good for the North. More people means more tax revenue. Typically, it means a larger, more robust economy as well. It also means drafting and finding volunteers for an army much easier. The North also contains 90% of the United States factories. This means producing weapons, supplies, literally everything about industry, manufacture, and everything. Absolutely everything is easier having all of this industrial capacity in the North. Northern banks also had significantly larger cash reserves than Southern banks, which is advantageous. I don't need to spell that one out for you. The North has a lot of advantages going into the war. The South has a population of about 9 million people as a whole. 3 million of them were slaves. That means there's only 6 million free white people, and only a portion of them are military-aged males. You see where I'm going with this. They're already at a disadvantage. This makes raising and sustaining an army extremely difficult. Like we said, the North has 90% of the manufacturing capability. That means the South only has 10%. So not looking good for them in terms of manufacturing arms, keeping up with uniforms and rations and all sorts of things like that. There's also significantly less railroads in the South. There are a lot of railroads in the South, but definitely not as many as the North. They're not as extensive. And that means that there are far easier to blow up, easier to dismantle, easier to disrupt supply chains. It's going to be we're going to see that with the Shermans March to see here in a couple of slides. And a lot of the banks in the South were small local banks. They weren't regional like they were in the North, and that means they had not as large cash reserves. Also, less people, less cash. Moving forward, the South is going to have constant money problems. If the South had half as much money as the North, it's very plausible they could have won. We'll talk about the military leaders and leadership in general during the Civil War, but that is one place where the South absolutely shined. The North did not have a lot of very good military tacticians or leadership or things like that. A diplomatic challenge for the South, for the Confederacy. We just talked about how they're fighting a very much uphill battle. They need support, and they're going to search for it in foreign governments. Remember when we talked about Texas, I told you to keep in mind how Britain and France were considering supporting the Texans. People remember this, and that is exactly where the Confederate government is going to look for support. France and Britain. They have massive textile industries that are depending on Confederate cotton. So these are logical decisions to reach out for help. France gets back to them first and basically says, we'll help if Britain helps, but we're not going to do it on our own. And Britain is weary, kind of the same way that France was in the beginning of the American Revolution. Same idea. What they want is to see that the Confederacy can gain several victories before Britain jumps in and takes the risk of opposing the original, traditional American government as opposed to the Confederate American government. They're a little bit weary. They want to make sure the South can win on their own first before throwing their eggs in that basket. It's kind of a catch-22 for the South because they need the support to win, and they need the win to get the support. I alluded to this just a second ago, but the definition of insanity, I want you guys to realize what is happening here. Britain told Texas they would buy all of their cotton so long as they freed the slaves. And it gets to the point where, the South is actually looking fairly strong early on. And they're still a little weary, but they go to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government and say, listen, we will support you monetarily and militarily, which means also the French will. Just throwing that out there. We will support you monetarily and militarily. All you have to do is free your slaves. This is the exact same deal they made Texas. And Texas said no, and then went under. They failed as a country. This is only 25 years later. People who were alive for the Texan Revolution are very much still alive and well during the American Civil War. Sam Houston is alive and there for both. You would think that they wouldn't make the same mistake twice, and they absolutely do. This is just something that has always stuck in my mind as such a mind-numbingly easy decision. Like we talked about with Texas, there is there's no minimum wage. It's not like they have to just, like the South could free the slaves and then pay them a penny a week, and that would be freeing slaves. It would be kind of like a serfdom, but it would be enough to satisfy Britain. Also, they could free the slaves, get Britain's support, and then re-engage in slavery. There's just so many avenues that the South could have taken to win the war, and their pride would not let them. And we'll see that a couple more times moving forward. 1861, we have the Trent Affair. So in the middle of all this negotiating with Britain and what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, there is a British ship they are carrying two Confederate diplomats. One is John Stidell and James Mason. They are envoys to England and France, and they are on their way to Europe, and they are stopped by a northern vessel while they're stopped in Cuba. Britain is absolutely furious that the U.S. would have the gall to stop one of their ships. They're not at war. They have no right. Britain is pissed. And they send an ultimatum to the U.S. government demanding the release of the two diplomats. And this is about as close as Britain ever gets to militarily supporting the Confederacy, because they send several detachments of soldiers to Canada and sent reinforcements for their Navy all the way around North America. Basically saying, you're going to free those guys or we're all going to war. And this makes Lincoln back down. He frees the two diplomats, stating publicly one war at a time. He doesn't need to open up another front. That would be, an interesting alternate history. How would the Union have fared if they had to fight a two-front war? One with the South in the South and one with British Canada in the North. Interesting thought experiment there. A lesser-known puzzle piece here: Russia. Russia never gets talked about during the American Revolution, and are probably the main reason that Britain did not end up supporting the Confederacy, regardless of the whole cotton freeing slaves debacle. The U.S. ambassador to Russia, a guy named Cassius Marcellus Clay, absolutely deserving of his own episode. The Fat Electrician does a fantastic video on Cassius Clay. It was one of the first videos of his I ever watched. It's fantastic. It's super entertaining. Cassius Clay was an absolute badass. I know you can't click the link in the slideshow. It's just there to remind you that it is in the description. If you want to go check it out, that'll link you right over to there. Please go check it out. I love the Fat Electrician. He was absolutely an inspiration for me starting this channel. Okay, again, another rant over. Cassius Clay. He is the ambassador to Russia, and he convinces Russia not to support the Confederacy. The Confederacy was reaching out to a bunch of different places beyond just France and Britain. They went to several European countries. Cassius Clay says, do not support the Confederacy. He also tells both France and Britain that if they even recognize the Confederacy as a country, not support them, if they just say, we recognize your validity as a country, Russia will declare war on them both. So it's a big deal. It doesn't get talked about, and he is basically the main reason why the Confederacy never gets any European support. And why was he so keen? Why was Russia itself so keen on supporting the Union? They liked the idea that the U.S. was, as a whole, and would not be able to do so if it were split in half, that the U.S. was balancing out the U.K. geopolitically. The U.K., especially still at this time, 1860s, was very imperial. Their empire was very vast, and the idea that the United States was fairly anti-imperial, especially for the next couple decades at least, they kind of evened each other out. And Russia liked that because Russia also had a fairly sizable empire, and they didn't want the UK to encroach on it. So a little bit selfish there, but that's kind of the reason. I like putting this in here because, like I said, Russia doesn't get talked about. And also, go watch that Fat Electrician episode. It's fantastic. The Emancipation Proclamation and the lies your textbook tells you, it's kind of a load of crap, to be honest with you. I, again, trying to remain as impartial as possible, but there are a couple of presidents who have a legacy that I do not think they deserve, and Lincoln is very much one of them. And it starts with, honestly, the martial law from a couple of slides ago, but gets continued with the Emancipation Proclamation. Before I start crapping on it, what is it? It was a decree that Lincoln puts forward that sounds like it frees slaves. And it doesn't actually free any slaves. The problem is the Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves in all states that were at war with the Union. And that sounds really good until you start to think about it for more than 30 seconds. Any state that is at war with the Union is by definition a separate country. They are part of the Confederate States of America. That means Lincoln has no authority there because he's not the president of the Confederate States of America. Where he does have authority is anywhere that were the border states we just talked about. Areas where he absolutely had the authority to free those slaves, and he did not because he was afraid of upsetting those border states and pushing them into the hands of the Confederacy. So, what this does is absolutely nothing. It frees slaves in a country where he's not president, and does not free slaves in a country where he is president. He allowed slavery to persist in areas where he had authority, and basically tried to tell another country to stop doing that with a piece of paper signed by a country that's not that country. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about this, like a lot of stuff we talk about on here. But he gets this legacy as the great, freer of slaves, the great abolisher of slavery, and it is absolutely unwarranted. He didn't free any slaves, especially with the Emancipation Proclamation. So yeah, I'll stop there on that rant because it's gonna get it's gonna get continued here. He just did a lot of really shitty things. We talked about how his main prerogative was preserving the Union, and that blind intent led him to make some very unfortunate decisions. I'm also now seeing how crappily this image rendered, so I apologize for that. Anyways, Lincoln violates the Constitution several times, and he defends it basically by saying it's wartime emergency, and that overrides the people's rights. He is extending martial law basically to allow himself to do whatever he wants. And he goes ahead and prevents all state legislatures in the North from meeting. He denies opposition newspapers use of the U.S. mail system, and he even used Army units to shut some of the mail system down to stop those opposition newspapers. He goes and jails hundreds of, not even proven, but suspected Confederate sympathizers without the right of habeas corpus. He suspends habeas corpus across the board. And one egregious example of that is, I forget the guy's name, but I'll look it up and maybe put it in post. He jails a politician for the entire, in 1861, he jails a politician for the entire remainder of the war, which ends in 1865, by the way, who made a speech that was claiming that Lincoln was extending the war. A clear violation of the First Amendment. He throws him in jail the same way we would joke that Stalin would. He was a tyrant. There's no way around it. Politics aside, let's get back to the war itself. Geography, what is important as we are moving forward? What are some areas of importance? What are going to be some tactical spots? What are we going to do here? We have two major fronts. We have the Eastern and the Western Theater. Eastern Theater contained both capitals that are only 100, or actually less than 100 miles apart. We have Washington, D.C. as the capital of the North and Richmond, Virginia as the capital of the South. That's going to be a really big deal. You can see them on the map here. The star is Washington, D.C., and then this dot is Richmond. Going to be some contented there. In the Western Theater, it's going to be mostly centered around the Mississippi River. We care about the Mississippi River so much because, like we said, a lot of the railroads in the South are very far east. The Mississippi River is basically the South's only means of getting supplies across its western territories, the western states there. It's going to be a very big deal. What we have on the map here, it's a reused map, and the arrows are areas of escape for slaves. But I thought it was just a good map of the eastern U.S. that showed both capitals and north and southern states, and then the border states here as well. The First Battle of Bull Run, one of the first decisive, really important battles, happens in 1861. There are 30,000 Northern troops. They invade Virginia, and they're trying to capture Richmond. Remember, it's only 100 miles away, and it would be a massive blow to the South if they could capture Richmond. They encounter what is actually a significantly smaller Confederate force near a stream called Bull Run. This is the first Battle of Bull Run. We'll talk about the second later. And the Union is expecting a very quick and easy victory, so much so that there are civilians that come along and set up a picnic on a hill to watch the battle. People in the North think the war is going to end right here. There are children and civilians picnicking to watch this battle. It's just a fun fact that I always find it's very hard to believe. And unfortunately for the North, the Confederate soldiers, like we talked about before, they're a lot better organized, they're better run, they have better tacticians, and they very quickly force the Union to retreat. The South wins the Battle of Bull Run, and with that, both the soldiers and the civilians that were picnicking are forced to flee back over the border into D.C., the North capital. Jefferson Davis saves the Union. This is another weird one. There's several weird circumstances that come up that seem very hard to believe, almost like we're living in an alternate reality of where everything happened perfectly so the North could win. It's weird. We'll talk about another one here in a couple slides. But so the Confederacy wins at Bull Run, and Stonewall Jackson, who was a general for the Confederacy, he goes to Jefferson Davis and says, "Listen, give me 10,000 troops, and I'll sack Washington tomorrow, Washington D.C." And Jefferson Davis says no. He does not want to be the aggressor in this war. He wants to fight a defensive war. He doesn't want to be the one furthering the war. He doesn't want to be the one that is continuing the war. What he wants is the war, not to get into the trope too bad, but he wants it to be a war of northern aggression. He wants the North to be the aggressor. He wants to look like he's just defending himself. He wants the South to look like a victim, basically, and not this bully. He wants the North to look like a bully. So he denies that request and arguably saves the Union, because it's very possible that Stonewall Jackson reinforcing the troops at Bull Run and then chasing the Union to D.C., they could have sacked it. That's a very plausible potential outcome. And the South continues to wipe the floor. In the beginning, they have a lot of victories. So with the failure of Bull Run, Lincoln hires a new general, a guy named George McClellan. He retrains and reorganizes the Union Army. There is a battle called the 7 Days Battle. Guess how long it lasted. It's McClellan's first battle, and they force him to retreat. He gets fired basically immediately. Lincoln's like, "You're out, new guy in." The next guy is the general by the name of John Pope. And at the second battle of Bull Run, they make him retreat as well. He gets fired. Another guy named Ambrose Burnside also is forced to retreat at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And finally, General Joe Hooker gets decimated by Robert E. Lee with an army half the size at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So in the beginning, the South is making Lincoln's generals out to look like excuse me. Oh boy, that's all I know. Pardon the interruption. They are making Lincoln's generals not look good at all. And this is going to make Lincoln fairly upset fairly quick. And remember, like I said, this is all a symptom of the North not having very good military leaders early on. And another fun fact is Robert E. Lee was Lincoln's first pick to lead the Union Army. He was a West Point grad. If you remember earlier, in earlier episodes, he led the Marines for Lincoln when they were sent to put down that uprising. He was very much a Union man, but when he was asked to lead the Union Army, he told Lincoln that he couldn't fight against his home state of Virginia. So that's how he became a Confederate general. So there was a lot of good military tacticians that turned their back on the North. A stroke of luck. This is the kind of the other thing, the very weird set of circumstances that comes along that allows the North to get the edge. And this is where some of the generals kind of override Jefferson Davis. All of those victories in a row and kind of embarrassing Lincoln's generals, they get a little bit overconfident. They feel like they could invade the North and kind of put an end to this war. So what they do is they split the army up. Robert E. Lee is going to take half of the army to D.C., and he wants to take it from the north. And then Stonewall Jackson is going to take the other side to seize the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And this is going to be kind of a two-front deal and kind of shut down the two big operating areas of the Union Army. Previously disgraced General McClellan, he has a patrol out and he finds a bundle of cigars that are wrapped in a copy of Robert E. Lee's battle plans. Those get brought back to McClellan, and now the Union knows exactly how and where the army was split up and how exactly they can ambush and destroy Lee's forces. What are the odds of that? So, using those plans, McClellan attacks Lee's forces near Antidum Creek, which is just outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland. In the south, this is usually called the Battle of Sharpsburg. In the north, it's usually called the Battle of Antietam. I don't know why there's that distinction, but if you're ever confused, they're the same thing. This was the single bloodiest day of the war. The South lost 110,000 men, and the North lost even more than that. Regardless of taking less losses, the South retreats. However, the North was too beaten down. They had too many losses to be able to pursue them back over the lines. The Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. It was a 2-day battle on the Mississippi border. Confederate troops surprised Union troops. However, the Northern troops were saved by a set of reinforcements, and those reinforcements killed a Confederate general by the name of Albert Sidney Johnston. Both sides lose roughly 12,000 men, and this is where Ulysses S. Grant kind of starts to get his the legacy that is given to him in terms of not quite having a resentment for the South, because he respected a lot of the soldiers that fought there, but almost to a fault. He realized that the South was not going to give up. And the famous quote from him is here on this last bullet here. He says, "I gave up all the idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest." So what he's saying here is basically, we're not going to get those Southerners to surrender. We are going to have to conquer the entirety of the South. So, where this war is decided. Hard to tell in the moment, but in hindsight of 2025, this is where we see the North is going to win the war, and the South is assuredly going to lose the war. So, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a Northern victory on July 3rd of 1862. Union casualties are about 23,000. Confederate casualties about 28,000. Robert E. Lee flees back to the South. Lincoln orders the North to pursue him, but they fail. This is a turning point for the war in the North. Again, they don't know it at the time. However, this is the last time the South would be able to invade the North. And keep in mind, this is only 1862. The war's been going on for roughly a year. It's not going to end until 1865. So from here on out, the South is fighting very much a defensive war, kind of what Jefferson wanted from the beginning. But they're going to be very much on their heels from here on out. This is a massive loss for foreign support as well. So we talked about the pressure from the Russians before, and this loss ensures Britain, and by proxy France, is not going to recognize the Confederacy. They're all out on foreign aid here. Lincoln gives his famous Gettysburg Address here, but in November, the war was in July, so the battle rather was in July. In November, he has his speech, which is Well, it's very famous. And at the end, he plays Dixie, and he promises that these dead shall not die in vain. And that gets interpreted a lot of different ways. We can have a total discussion about that. But I think he thought that this war was necessary for the country as a whole, both North and South, to be able to get over and reconcile this disagreement about slavery. I think he believed that without a war, the country never would have been able to operate as a whole. I think he thought there would always be a division, and it's these men giving their lives right now that are going to, eventually allow the country to heal regardless of how bad it is right now. A lot of the battles we've been talking about so far are all on the Eastern Front. In the Western Front, what's going on here? Remember we talked about basically everything after July of 62. The Confederacy is on their heels. By this time, also, the Union has occupied the vast majority of western Tennessee, and the New Orleans had surrendered without firing a shot. There was no Battle of New Orleans like there was in the War of 1812. Basically, they knew they were beat, and they didn't want more loss of life. So that's how that kind of happened. Again, oversimplification, but regardless. The Mississippi River. The Union wants to take control of the Mississippi River. We talked about its strategic importance a minute ago, and how they're going to do that is they need to take Vicksburg, Mississippi. And Grant's troops, they lay siege to that city for 47 days. The residents inside are so starved for supplies and food that they begin eating mules, horses, and dogs. This is all happening during the Battle of Gettysburg, and the city of Vicksburg surrenders the same day that Lee retreats from Gettysburg, which is July 4th of 1863. Did I write that wrong? That is wrong. This should be 1862. Excuse me. 5 days later, on July 9th, the last Confederate port on the Mississippi River falls. And this means that Texas and Arkansas, the two states that were producing the most food for the Confederacy, are cut off from the rest of the country. By the end of 1863, only Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia are remaining. For the most part, Texas and Arkansas are not starved out, but cut off. They can't really help. Getting to the end of the war, Lincoln orders General Sherman to take what was left of the South. They'd been doing a pretty good job over the past year of taking a lot of Confederate territory. Sherman's March to the Sea is a very famous set of battles. Union troops under General Sherman, they march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, and then back up to Raleigh, North Carolina. And you can see on the map here, there's Savannah, Atlanta. So they're marching here and then going up to Raleigh. So this is the path that they're taking. And along that path, 60 miles wide, they burn everything. Towns, mills, factory, railroads, farms, every single thing that they could do to disrupt anything having to do with Southern infrastructure, they burn. This is where the Sherman necktie comes about, if you've ever heard about that. They are destroying railroads upon this that are on this path, like we talked about. And sometimes they're blowing them up, sometimes they're digging them up, sometimes they dismantle them, put the ties over a fire, and then bend them around a tree. This makes sure that if the South were to go and rebuild those railroads, they cannot reuse those rails. They have to get new ones, which are expensive, hard to make, expensive to move, and remember, the South has very little industrial capacity in the beginning of the war, let alone when it's all getting burned down. This Sherman's March is beyond devastating to the South. It starves them out. It relieves them of what very little supplies and infrastructure they had left by this point in time. It absolutely decimates the South. And the war ends in 1865. The South officially surrenders April 9th of 1865. And there's a couple of accommodations that the North gives the South. They guarantee that any Southern soldiers are not going to be tried for treason. And this actually comes from order of Lincoln. Like kind of we talked about with the Gettysburg Address, I think that he thought this was necessary for the nation to heal, and those lives, like he said, will not be lost in vain. I don't think he wanted the people who fought, regardless on either side, to be punished for being part of what eventually was going to heal the country. He believed that the war is punishment enough for both sides. And basically, both sides are going to suffer pretty hard. We're going to talk about Reconstruction in the next episode. But he kind of argued that all of the suffering both sides are going to have here for a long while after the Civil War was punishment for both sides' mistreatment towards Africans. And right before the South officially surrenders, this House of Representatives is going to pass the 13th Amendment, which does officially outlaw slavery in the United States. So it's this piece of paper that frees slaves, not the Emancipation Proclamation. Women's role in the Civil War. Like a lot of wars, both before and after, women are left behind, for the most part, to manage the family, farms, businesses, the stuff that they would traditionally do, but also the men's jobs because they're off to war. But they were also on the battlefield. It was not uncommon to have female nurses on the battlefield. They were a lot of the staff in Army hospitals. Elizabeth Blackwell, if you've ever heard that name, this is where she came to light. This is kind of where she became famous because of her contributions to the war. She was the first ever female doctor in the United States, and she started a training program for nurses and created what at the time was called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which gave a bunch of medical supplies and services to those Army hospitals. She kind of set the stage for government-sanctioned medical intervention in war, if that makes sense. This is going to set the stage for things like the Red Cross and stuff like that. And remember, the women were a lot of the pushers towards those reforms we talked about in the last episode. And a lot of the bravery and courage shown by women during the Civil War kind of broke down a lot of the walls that they were facing. The idea that women are weaker than men, and kind of gave their want for those reforms a little more validity. It gained them a step up in a lot of those pushes. Lincoln is assassinated 5 days after the Union wins the war. Lincoln is shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater. Best we can tell, Booth was upset at a speech Lincoln made after the war when he was talking about the future of American government, and he mentioned African Americans taking positions of power in the government. And that is what sparked Booth to assassinate him. There's a lot of different theories for this. This is the one I've seen put forth the most. It's probably the most plausible, but if you guys have any other thoughts, let me know in the comments below. We'll never truly know, but that is, I think, the most plausible one. And then I have another Jeopardy that I made for the classes I was teaching at this time. This is also linked in the description below if you guys want to check that out. I do think they're a lot of fun. I know this is a controversial episode. This was a very topical take on the U.S. Civil War. However, I think it's really important. I know I went on a couple of rants in here. I'm very passionate about this. If you guys want to have a debate in the comments below, I am here for it. Remember, just keep it civil, and no pun intended. And thanks for coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.